everyone. Welcome to the Boston City Council's Ayanna Chamber, and I apologize for starting a little bit late. We are here for a hearing in the Council's Committee on Planning, Development, and Transportation on docket number 0175, order for a hearing regarding equitable access to public transportation with a cashless fare collection system. This docket was sponsored by Councillor Ayanna Pressley, who is here to my left, and myself. And I'm proud to I'll introduce myself, Michelle Wu, City Councilor at Large and Chair of this committee. We are also joined, in addition to the co-sponsor, by Councillor Anissa Sabi George, also serving at large, as well as District 2 City Councilor Ed Flynn. I'm sure more of my colleagues will come in as we go, and we'll introduce them as they arrive. I want to remind everyone that this public hearing is being recorded and broadcast live on channels Comcast 8, RCN 82, and Verizon 1964, as well as being live streamed on the City of Boston website. If the audience could just do a quick check, silence your cell phones and devices, and remember that we will take public testimony, I think throughout the course of the hearing, maybe inserting some if we have time between the two panels that are scheduled. So if you would like to testify, please sign in on the sheets over here and check the right box to make sure that we have to know that you wish to speak. Okay, so at this point, I will hand it over to the lead sponsor for a statement, as well as any other statements from my colleagues before turning it over to our distinguished guests. Councillor Ayanna Pressley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for co-sponsoring this hearing order with me and for your leadership in the space of transit and social justice every day. Very delighted to be partnering on this with you. I want to thank my colleagues in government who are here so far. We do anticipate more coming. We want to thank the MBTA, and of course we want to thank riders and advocates for being a part of this very important conversation, a timely one while we are considering major changes to our public transit system. Again, I want to thank the MBTA for participating in what we trust will be a frank conversation with this body and with the community. We are all here to offer our partnership to the MBTA as they are working towards providing a more efficient and reliable and accessible system. This is not a forum meant to assign blame or to disparage anyone on either of these panels. We need this system to work for every single rider, and I know we can strengthen any proposal by including more voices at the table, not less. It is also essential we engage these voices to seek out their recommendations to ensure a smoother implementation and to alleviate financial burden, hardship, and to remove any barriers to purchasing T cards and to rider access. Without input from riders and community voices and cooperative partnership from the MBTA, the move to a cashless system has the potential to result in a heavier burden to our most vulnerable residents, including and especially lower income communities and elderly populations, most of whom are underbanked and without access to ATM cards or to smartphones. It is my hope that this hearing will instruct the official rollout of this new policy, putting consumer and rider experience, input, and perspective at the forefront, as well as better educating the public about the policy. I'm looking forward to our hearing and the opportunity for all of us to learn about each other's perspectives and to offer advice based on our own experiences with the T, as well as continuing to push the broader dialogue and solutions to ensure equity in access, affordability, reliability for every neighborhood, income level, age, and mobility. Again, I thank the Chair for her leadership on these issues and for her partnership in this hearing order.
Thank you, Councillor Pressley. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Councillor Wu. Thank you, Councillor Pressley, both of you, for your leadership on this issue. Mobile payments have been shown to increase convenience for many transit riders. The ability to re-go to Charlie Card, swipe a credit card, or use an app saves time and makes the process easier. However, my greatest concern in regard to cashless fare collection is the ability for those lacking smartphones or without access to a bank account or credit card. we must ensure those in lower income brackets or recent immigrants are still able to use our public transportation system. My parents rely on public transportation every day. Also, we see so many disabled people that also rely on public transportation every day, and we want to make sure that public transportation works for our elderly, for the disabled, and for our immigrants. Any policy change must address how it impacts our seniors and those who are underbanked or underprivileged. I look forward to working and hearing from the experts on this. And again, I just want to thank Councillor Pressley and Councillor Wu for your leadership on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Sabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to you and Councillor Pressley for bringing not just attention to this issue, but the decision makers to the table. I have a number of interests in this hearing order and in the information that's presented today, with a special focus on our Boston Public School students and their ability to access public transportation to get to and from school, to and from after-school activities and athletic programming, and as well as a few other things, but we'll get to it through questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sabi George. And so now we will turn it over to our panel. We have the Director of Fare Policy and Analytics, Laurel Paget-Seekins, and the Chief Technology Officer, David Block-Schechter. I also want to welcome and thank the General Manager, Luis Ramirez, for joining us, who's back there for now, but if it gets too tough, or if we have other questions, we will certainly ask you to join the panel as well. Feel free to give any statements, introduce yourselves, and I know you have a presentation to walk us through as well.
Great. Yeah, so I'll start and then I'll turn it over to Laurel, and I've got a presentation to walk you through, which I will. First off, just thank you for having us at this public forum. We're really excited about this opportunity to kick off this stage of our public outreach for this project in Boston, especially given its importance in the MBTA system. And with people who clearly care as deeply as we do, that being you and the public, about ensuring an equitable, efficient, and even occasionally delightful system. So that does not seem to be working anymore.
So while we're waiting, how many people took the T to get to the hearing today? Great. Lots of paying customers in the room.
Watch the password getting entered. Excellent. All right, that seems to be working great. So we're mostly here to listen, and that's in order to inform key decisions on fare policy that are enabled by the technology of this project. I thought it might be useful to start with some background on why we're embarking on this project, a little bit more detail on the project itself, and then we can talk about the policy decisions that we need your input on. So the biggest reason that we're excited about this project is because it impacts everyone, and because we have the opportunity, quite frankly, to make something invisible. The best fare collection system is one that gets out of people's way. Unfortunately, that's not the case right now. The current system was implemented in 2006 from a design that dates back almost a decade before that, and it's showing its age. It has design flaws, including a system that is offline. Remember, this is 2006, before the first iPhone. Much of the equipment is at the end of its useful life. It has accessibility problems, and it keeps us from being able to enact a more equitable fare policy because of software limitations. It also has a significant built-in flaw: the fare boxes at the front of the bus, and the acceptance of cash on vehicles, which slow down trips for everybody. As a bus rider myself, I know the frustration of being the person paying with cash on the bus because I didn't have any other option, and of waiting for people who pay with cash. In fact, we have a natural experiment from a free fare day we ran a few years back. This is all-door boarding on the Silver Line at Tufts in the picture. This is a picture 16 seconds in both instances. In the bottom is a typical day. You can see the crowd of people waiting at the front door to board. the top on a day which was free fares and therefore more riders, where everyone could board at all doors, this is what it looked like 16 seconds in. It's a significant difference. The most visible limitation of the Charlie card that we have right now is that because of the technology choices that were made, it couldn't practically be extended to commuter rail or ferry, which increases the inconvenience for all of our customers. This is exceeded perhaps only by a design flaw that sees machines that dispense only limited use magnetic stripe tickets rather than cards, leading to the sign that you see, which is no Charlie cards here with a little bit of extra ink on there that says ever. Not surprisingly, our riders have good ideas on what to fix, from integrated payment to online reloading, proof of payment to speed up buses and Green Line vehicles, subscription and auto pay services, using smartphones directly on vehicles to pay fares, making cards easily available, using a contactless credit card directly on the vehicle, and removing cash on board vehicles to speed up everyone's journey. I don't think I'm going to give anything away from the next few slides to say that we intend to do all of that. So, we awarded a contract to implement this system late last year. The goal is to improve the customer experience overall. This is not a technology project or a construction project. This is a customer project. Making buses faster, allowing more flexible and responsive fare policy, and ensuring that the system is in good working condition so that it's easier to pay for your ride, not just now, but also in 2030 when the system is 10 years old. It will be generally available to the public in 2020 on bus, subway, commuter rail, and ferry at all stations, on all vehicles, with a replacement of the gates themselves to a more modern, accessible system in the year subsequent. So what's changing from 1.0 to 2.0? Just to highlight a few issues. One, more fare media. We'll be issuing a new fare card, and we'll be accepting smartphones and contactless credit cards at the gates, on buses, everywhere. Better access. Every retail location and every fare vending machine will issue cards, and there will be more retail locations and on-street fare vending machines at key bus stops. Lastly, the same method to pay throughout the system. It's a tap, no swipes, and yes, no cash on board vehicles. So let me go through a few of those in detail. You can see here an image of what the validators will look like. Biggest change that we're going to see is that riders can board at any door with a large tap area. Most doors will have a reader on both sides of the doors to speed up boarding and alighting even more. During transition, the validators will be installed alongside the fare boxes, after which the fare boxes will be removed. We expect that this change will improve bus speeds by approximately 10%. That means a 30-minute trip takes 3 minutes less, and more buses can come every hour for higher frequency. This is why we're all so excited about this project. To enable this, we need to make it easier to pay before you board. That means card availability. It means not having to use or get a card at all, having it be available directly on your smartphone through Apple Pay and Samsung Pay in its own app, one that you can load cash on at a retail location or a fare vending machine, so that even if you're unbanked, if you have a smartphone, you can still pay or you can get a card. It also means more retail locations and more vending machines, including at bus stops, so that you're never far away from a place to load with cash on one end of your journey or the other. We will make it easier to manage your account online. This is table stakes in this day and age, but something that we don't have in the current system that was built too early. To manage your account, to see your travel history, to charge your account and set up auto recharge like with EasyPass, and to be able to set your language preferences, just like you'll be able to do with the fare vending machine, so that we are communicating with you in ways that you can understand. Also, many people get cards through their employers or schools, and we'll have tools to make that easier. No special cards or distribution. Any fare card, or even the app on your smartphone, will be able to be assigned to an employer or school account. No more lost cards or waiting days or weeks for distribution. The last thing that I want to emphasize is that the way you pay will be the same everywhere, a tap. That's because the system is all digital. Getting on a bus, tap your fare card, your smartphone, or your contactless credit card. Going through a subway gate, same thing. Getting on the ferry, the staff will be there and you'll tap on their handheld device. And on commuter rail, tap on to one of the station validators installed at convenient locations on every platform. Tap again when you get to your destination. Along the way, a conductor will ask you to show that you have paid. Guess how you show you have paid? You'll tap it on their handheld device. It seems like a small thing, but by unifying the method of payment across all travel options, it opens up a world of options in fare policy. With that, I'll turn it over to Laurel to talk more about the policy.
Thanks, David. So again, I'm so glad to be here. My name is Laurel Pettit-Seekins, and I am the Director of Fare Policy and Analytics for the MBTA. And I sort of joined the team to really sort of lead the policy conversations with both our internal and external stakeholders around some key decisions that we need to make in order to get the benefits of the project that David just mentioned. And so taking sort of those goals that David mentioned, we then created the things that David said in terms of the system design of how the system was designed, but now we need supporting policies and programs to make sure that those goals are actually achieved. So what I'm going to do is sort of walk through some of the main policy areas where we have decisions that we need input on, and then talk about sort of how we're going to be getting input over the next few years on these policy areas. So the first policy area is data privacy. This system, as David described it, will collect a lot more data on our passengers and our customers because you will be able to have your own account, which will link you to your travel data. So what we're working on is how to make sure that we're ensuring customer privacy and protection of that data in this new project. So that's the first policy area. The second is one that has been alluded to as sort of a key issue in this event, which is around access to fare cards and sales locations. As Dave mentioned, one of the key benefits of not having cash on board is to speed up all of our buses and trains, Green Line trains. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that everyone has access to the fare cards and to places to load them. And so there's two parts of this project, this policy area. One is about making sure that the fare vending machines and the retail locations are equitably distributed throughout our network so that everyone has access to them. And the second one is about sort of building programs around access to cards that we will give away for free because there's going to be a charge for the card in order for us to enable fare policies like being able to go negative on your card so that if you don't have access to a fare vending machine, you still have a way to get home. The third policy area is around inspections. So one of the pieces of this puzzle is that when we enable all-door boarding and speed up the buses through all-door boarding, we still need to be able to inspect for fares. And so we're going to change to a proof of payment system where you show that you have paid if you're asked on board on a vehicle. And so a key policy decision we're going to have to be making and that we really need input on is how we're going to set up these inspection teams. And the fourth area is one which I think is what everyone immediately thinks about, is what are the fares going to be, how they're going to be structured. So this includes not just fare products, but transfer rules and also sort of bigger structural changes to our fares that are now potentially possible, like time of day pricing or changes to different ways that we do the distance-based pricing that we currently do on commuter rail or distance-based pricing on other modes. And so that's the fourth area that we are going to be gathering input on. So, but this leads to some very sort of large policy trade-offs. There's a whole lot of details and a lot of things that we need to work out to make sure the system works for everyone, but there's also some sort of policy trade-off conversations that the MBTA is going to have with our public. So the first one, which I already spoke to, is that there really is this trade-off on getting those operational benefits to figuring out how to do inspections. And the second one is about the ability to offer all of these new fare products and what is the revenue impact on the MBTA. So those are some of the sort of key policy conversations that we'll be having with the public and with our, Board of Fiscal Management and Control Board over the next couple of years. So what I wanted to walk you through now was sort of how we're envisioning doing outreach on each of those four areas, and sort of open it up around sort of what are our plans for involving the public in these very important conversations. So this is just a quick sort of calendar to show that within these four areas, there's a lot of moving targets. So we need to implement policy decisions along with the technology in order to get the project done. And so where the decision needs to be made on each of these things has to do with how they fit into the technology schedule. But we're really trying to make sure we build in enough time for both input beforehand and in some cases to make sure that we have a public process available after the project has been implemented to make sure that we're evaluating the decisions that were made and making sure that the programs are working. So for data privacy, we will be hoping to get a draft of that done by the beginning of next calendar year. In the access to fare cards, we'll be throughout this year in the fall coming out to talk to communities around sort of where the fare vending machines will be. And then throughout the next couple of years, we'll be really working with community groups to figure out how we can make sure that everyone has access to cards even if they can't afford them. For fare inspections, we'll be working on that for the next couple of years to really get in place some principles, and then the MBTA will have a lot of work to do to sort of stand up that team. And then finally, on the fare products and structures, we'll be taking input throughout the entire process, but we don't anticipate any major changes to our fare structure to occur until the summer of 2021. So in order to sort of craft sort of our outreach plan, we actually did some stakeholder meetings with some folks who are already in the room here, who gave us some really great input on how we should be thinking about doing outreach. And we came up with these principles for outreach. So there's sort of four buckets of things that we're going to make sure that we're doing in our outreach around all four of those policy areas. The first one is being accountable. So really prioritizing getting feedback directly from communities that are going to be most impacted by the changes. And then, and sort of being sort of open to having sort of hard conversations about those changes. The second one is being accessible and proactive. So not only having meetings that are accessible, but really kind of going out and seeking out feedback from communities. The third is around transparency. We know that sometimes all of the jargon that we use and the language that we use can be very unclear, and so really wanting to provide clear information, especially about what decisions need to be made, who's making them, when they're being made, so people understand when they have a chance to give input. And also making sure that we're providing access and explaining the data that we're using to make those decisions. And finally, we want the process to be iterative. We want people to have a chance to give us feedback multiple times. We want to go out and hear people's concerns, figure out how to address them, and then give them a chance to sort of give feedback on those proposed solutions. So really sort of trying to build relationships throughout this process that will last past implementation, so we can check in after it's been implemented to make sure that it's working as we all intended it to work, and have mechanisms in place for solving problems that come up after implementation. And so we envision a whole bunch of different ways that we'll be doing this, depending on which of those policy areas that we're talking about. Some of them are obviously going to impact all of our riders. For example, what are the fares going to be? That's going to be an outreach process, I'm sure, where everyone will want to have input. Some of them are much more targeted on the communities that are going to be most impacted. For example, the removing of cash on board vehicles. So we're going to really try to go out and sort of listen to those communities to raise issues amongst that particular community on those projects or those policies. So there's a whole bunch of ideas that we've brainstormed with stakeholder groups about how to do this. And we'll be rolling out sort of particular outreach plans for each of the four policy buckets as we kick off each one. So there'll be a whole way, many ways for people to get involved in the project. And we really look forward to the input. We have updated content now on our MBTA website for AFC2, where people can sign up to get involved and to learn more about the project and to get information about any of the policy areas that I mentioned. We've also hired a communication or public outreach specialist who's going to be sort of leading a lot of efforts for us. Anthony Thomas, who's here today, who can answer questions afterwards about how people can get involved in the events that we're planning over the next few years. And so, yeah, so here's, let me go back one. Here's the website where people can get more information, an email address where you can email us any questions about the project, either on the technology side or the policy side. we really are looking forward to this project, but also doing it in a way that is collaborative and that really makes the system work better for everyone.
Thank you very much. So we'll move to questions from councillors at this point, and thank you. We'll start with the lead sponsor, Councillor Pressley.
Thank you again for your participation here today. Trying to see where I want to pick up here. So you were talking about just mechanisms that would be in place as this is being implemented, and I'm just curious what that looks like. Have you considered maybe some sort of coalition of advocates and writers that you could be conferring with in real time? Secondly, there are already access gaps when it comes to the loading of fare cards. So if that is a problem in the system right now, I just want to know how you will address that and what will inform that. So just to make sure that community voice and rider experience is at the center of this in the planning and where you're deciding where those machines will be. So that it's less about culture and behavior shift, but meeting people where they are. So I'll just start there.
So I'll do the second one first, which is the loading of cards. We're very aware that it's very hard to get a Charlie card currently, and that's one of the problems we're trying to solve with this new system. We brought some here with us today in case anyone needs a Charlie card. So as part of this outreach, we will be distributing Charlie cards to communities as we do it, because we know that sometimes they are hard to find. But the process that we're going to be using is going out to communities in the fall as part of our Better Bus project, as we're going out talking about, how do we improve the bus system, but really getting people's input, draw on a map, tell us where we need to have, fare vending machines, where we need to have access to be able to buy, add value to a card or get a card, so that we can make sure that as we sort of finalize where those locations are going to be, that we are meeting everyone's needs, and then also once that draft list is together, that we'll come back out around and sort of be meeting with folks like yourselves and other community organizations to making sure that we're not missing any locations that need to be served. And the other part of the project is really creating a process for which, if we miss something, that we have a way to change it afterwards. So if once we implement it and we realize that there's a location that we really missed, that we need to make sure has a fare vending machine or has access to a retail location, that we have a mechanism in place for addressing that after implementation of the system.
And so I guess my question is there a criteria that determines that? Because we have an access right now is not equitable. So what is the criteria? Is it determined based on foot traffic? And then also I'm thinking about, those communities that are completely transit dependent. And also thinking about communities that are harder for us to reach and engage. This is public transit. So how are we reaching individuals experiencing homelessness? How are we reaching individuals with disabilities? How are we reaching seniors?
Yeah, so part of our outreach plan is to really reach out to those organizations that are serving those communities and working with those communities that are hard to serve. For example, the homeless community, like reaching out to homeless shelters and other organizations to make sure that we're working with them, not just on the fare vending.
I'm getting some signs. If you could speak directly into the microphone a little. Thanks.
Not that we're working with them on sort of placement of fare vending machines, but working with them on developing programs to make sure that they have access to fare media, the cards in the future, to be able to figuring out how we can make sure that they're able to help us distribute cards for free to communities that need them. So really trying to figure out how we build programs with community organizations and social service agencies to make sure that we're serving those communities. In terms of the criteria for the fare vending machines, we do have a set of criteria that our vendor who is implementing the project has to abide by, that both sets sort of which are the major locations, like you mentioned, around foot traffic, like at our stations where there have to be fare vending machines, as well as sort of an overall standard of how many and maybe David remembers the number for sure, like what percentage of the journeys have to be covered. But then beyond that, I think the other part of this project will be setting those criteria that you mentioned for both in this part and also afterwards, if we need to make a change, how we're going to prioritize stations. So or locations. That is part of the sort of outreach now, is what is that set of criteria that we need to make sure.
And just so I'm clear, this is a malleable process, right? So you're having a two-way conversation. So the outreach that you will be doing to engage these community-based organizations is to then integrate within the implementation these recommendations. Not all of them, but many of them. Yeah. Then in real time, as the new policy and protocols are being implemented, you will develop some sort of in-house mechanism. That was what I was getting to about, will there be ongoing conversations with a coalition of youth in transit-dependent communities, and are, in the process that we're eliminating all the barriers that we struggle with right now.
Yes,
and those inequalities, language access,
Yes. So one of the things we're still figuring out is how we make sure that we have the right group of people to be checking in with, so to make sure that actually is a representative of the communities that most need to have their voices heard. So that is something that we're still working on. It's like, how do we make sure that we create some sort of body where we can check in on, that actually is able to give us feedback that's representative. But we do want to have sort of, like I said, the iterative process to make sure that we're having those ongoing sort of check-ins on any process development. So we identify concerns with what we have proposed, sort of identify solutions with groups, and then sort of come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just 2 quick things. So on the, I was asking about the criteria for a loading fare machine.
Yeah.
And what is that foot traffic, and how is that data collected? Do you, send someone there? Is there a study? Can you just take it at the word of a community organization? How do you determine that?
So we are using foot traffic in terms of where people are currently using our system. So boardings on our existing system comes from the data that we get from our existing fare collection system. And David,
as well as from our automated passenger counters. And so the criteria is based on a certain number of journeys that have to be met. So we want to make sure that, and there's a number of other criteria as well, but the key ones are that a certain percentage of journeys need to be within 1,000 feet of a fare vending machine that you can load with cash, or a retail location. And then a certain number more need to be within slightly larger distance. So we can make sure that all of the journeys are met. Now, what Laurel mentioned as well is that those are cold, hard numbers, and they get to a certain amount of fare vending machines and a certain amount of retail locations in a certain number of places. But that doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of the ground, or on the ground, or the lived experience. So we've got a facility within this to be able to add additional ones. And those ones don't have a particular criteria. Those are the ones that are there to reflect what the things that the math doesn't show.
Could you give me a sense of how many machines we have right now?
Yeah.
Do you have an inventory of that?
Yeah, the numbers are not going to be exact coming out of my head, but I believe it's about 450 fare vending machines, almost entirely at stations, and then another about 125 retail locations or so. And we can get you the exact numbers after this. And they're located mostly on the retail locations, are quite frankly located mostly around commuter rail stations, and much less within the city. The projections, and these are not final numbers, are that we're going to be, I believe, closer to about 800 fare vending machines in about 600 retail locations. Again, these aren't final numbers. Okay. And the gross number doesn't matter. It's where they are that really matters, right? 1,400 fare vending machines at City Hall isn't going to help anyone. But the point is that they have to meet this criteria that they're distributed. It's a lot more of them, but hopefully they're also in the right places. And we've got the mechanisms, if they're not, to get them to the right places.
And then my other question is just in terms of youth. I know you have some sort of youth advisory council or something like that, and that's correct, right?
We have a youth pass program.
Yes, I know, but is there any mechanism right now where you do hear youth voice, because they are, one of our most dominant rider groups, and they are at a disadvantage in many ways. And so I just want to make sure that their right of voice is being heard in this, because I and the co-sponsor and many others do have a concern about the enforcement of this policy and what that impact will be. So could you just talk about what mechanisms are in place right now to hear youth voice? And then secondly, enforcement, and how will that be handled, and how will we make sure that it doesn't in any way contribute to what is already a relationship with a great deal of mistrust? Because I do see them being the most vulnerable to enforcement in this, mostly not just because of concerns about bias and profiling, but they will be at a greater disadvantage in terms of actually having the funds. I mean, we see that right now. So what will you be doing around enforcement, taking these things into account?
Yes, that's a very good question, and something that there's a lot of work that we have to do on. In terms of the sort of right now, we don't have any like official youth advisory council. I did a lot of work of setting up the Youth Pass program, which came out of sort of a coalition of young people really leading the effort on that, and so worked very closely with them. And I want to thank the City of Boston for being a partner in that and for administering the Youth Pass program for us and with us, and have really sort of built some relationships with your Youth Employment and Engagement Office through that process. So hopefully we can work with them on this project as well to sort of continue building a relationship with young people in this project, because we do realize the issues around enforcement, and that was something that definitely came up when we were working on the Youth Pass as a way to make sure that the last point that you raised around their ability to pay was something that we were understanding. And so that's sort of where the Youth Pass came in. And so on the issue of sort of proof of payment and fare inspections, one of the things that we will be going out and seeking public input on, and really sort of working with those communities that we feel like are going to be most impacted by this, is sort of how we're going to set that up. What are going to be the principles in which we're going to use to do inspections, and that's going to be sort of the like what comes out of that. I envision what comes out of that engagement process is setting up some clear principles of how that enforcement and inspections are going to happen, so that we can use to then set up a system for doing it. And part of that, if you remember back the map, is part of that, or the time chart, is that we'll also be sort of evaluating that afterwards. So we'll be making sure that we're sort of checking in on, is it working after it's up and running as well.
But right now, the implementation would be done by transit police?
That is a decision that has not been made. So we're still figuring out how it would be done, who would be doing it, what training they would need. All of the sort of nuts and bolts is something that we're still asking for input on.
Okay. Well, it is my hope that it would be persons that are unarmed, and that will look at, flexible alternatives amongst, personnel. I don't know if that would mean, new hiring or personnel, but, and then my last question, I thank the chair and the co-sponsor for her indulgence here. My last question for this round is, again, thinking about youth and just transit-dependent communities. Have you considered piloting, lower fare? Is this something that you're open to, just again, given the disproportionate burden that is anticipated?
Yeah, that we've started to hear input on that. It's something that our board has discussed. I assume you're meaning like a means-tested sort of low-income fare. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, that is something that has been discussed, and so something that we will continue to look into as part of the sort of general conversation around fare policy. That is sort of one of the policy areas that we'll be discussing. I do want to mention back on the inspection issue, the other piece of it is the sort of adjudication piece, and currently the fine levels are set in state law. So right now the MBTA does not have a lot of flexibility around fines for fare citations, and so that is something that we will also have to be considering.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Pressley. Councillor Sabi George.
Thank you, Chair. Again, thank you for that thoughtful, thorough presentation. I do have some questions about how our students will be able to access the system. Will they continue to use the one card, which is new, or do they have to change that system as well?
I mean, obviously, Boston Public Schools is one of our major partners, and so we will be, working closely with them to make sure that it works. I think it will actually improve the system for them in terms of, I don't know if this is news to anyone, but students tend to lose cards often, and so this will, I think, will actually make it easier for us and the Boston Public Schools to make sure that as those cards are lost, that they're still getting access, so that it's much easier to turn cards on and off in the new system, so that report a loss, get a new card is a much easier transaction. So we'll definitely be working with Boston Public Schools to make sure that whatever cards they're using will be compatible with our system. I'm not envisioning any major changes to sort of the relationship that we currently have with Boston Public Schools. One of the things that I'm really excited about that we have done over the last couple of years is expanded access to the student fare for the summer. So now young people who get their card from BPS, even if the school isn't paying for it for the summer, can access the student half-price fare on all of our buses and trains, and a $30 monthly pass during summer months at all of our fare vending machines. So that's a change that we made 2 years ago that we're hoping more and more students can take advantage of. And that part of what this will do is allow us to sort of more standardize the access to fares that young people get, regardless of whether Boston Public Schools is paying for their fare card or not.
Will it increase the cost of our students to ride the T?
So there's no
Both during the school year and in the
there's
summer?
no inherent sort of fare increase in the technology. That is obviously a policy question around like what fares will be, but there's no inherent sort of change to the fare price in the technology part of the project.
What is the cost over the next few years of rolling this out from 0 to 100%?
Yep, so it's a public-private partnership which is paid for over the course of the next 13 years. And so there's a part of that which is the capital project, and then there's a part of that which is the operating cost, which will no longer be incurring from operating the program ourselves. And so the contract award in November of 2020 was for up to $700 million, including both the capital and the operating portion. In sort of rough estimates, that's about half going to capital and half going to operating. If we look back in not having those slides in front of me, that ends up actually being less than we would have spent on the system otherwise.
And then I imagine some of the private partnership might be advertising, whether it be on the cards or on the kiosks.
We have not yet envisioned that.
Is there a way to restrict within the contract certain advertisement categories on any of the places where there could be advertising?
With the card itself, there's in the contract, there's nothing about advertising, which means that they don't have any rights to put it without us saying so.
And then on the kiosks,
The same thing.
there's no rights for advertising?
Correct, on the fare vending machines.
On the fare vending machines. All right, and then I had read, I don't know if it was I think it was in your presentation, but talk a little bit more, please, about folks that don't have, whether it's a credit card or a debit card or online banking opportunities to get cash to be put on these cards.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that we spent a lot of time with and thinking about, because as you move to a system where you can't pay with cash on board, you need to increase the opportunities for people to use cash off board. So number one is that each and every fare vending machine issues a card. Each and every fare vending machine accepts cash. Number two is that there are more fare vending machines, not just in the places that they are right now, which are predominantly in stations and a very small number of major bus terminals like Dudley, but that they are at key locations throughout the metropolitan area in order to ensure the standards that we talked about of you're never on one end or the other of your journey, you can reload. Also, a significant increase in the number of retail locations. And when we say retail locations, that's kind of a cold term. What we mean by that is both large big box retail stores, so think about your CVS's or your Walgreens or that sort of place, as well as your sort of smaller merchants, including bodegas and small neighborhood stores. The technology, unlike the technology today, which requires a rather cumbersome box, which takes up room and costs money and all of those things. So small retailers don't want to have it in their store. You can actually, from a retailer, reload it through an application on an Android phone, which means that it opens it up to pretty much any retailer that's out there to be able to do so. And so we think that those are really the ways that people end up loading cash. We think that that's a really significant expansion of that ability.
And then, one of the challenges right now that a lot of the riders experience is either no cards available or the terminal is down. Is there an ability to show on the kiosks, this terminal is either not accepting cash at this time, but the nearest terminal is located at?
The second thing, I'd have to check. On the first thing, number one, each fare vending machine issues cards. So we don't have the situation that we have now. And each fare vending machine accepts cash. So we don't have that same issue. The other thing, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the key part of the public-private partnership here is that there's these service level agreements. So essentially, with our private partner, and these are going to be, for example, numbers not exactly as taken from the contract, but if a fare vending machine isn't issuing cash for 2 hours and they haven't fixed it, they get a performance deduction, which means that they have an incentive to fix it, which is why I feel very confident to say that the system that we put in place in 2020 and the system that is running in 2030 will be functioning just as well, because we have a private partner who has a financial interest in making sure that that's the case. And all of those performance regimes are correlated or set up for customer-facing incidents. This is really about a way to protect the customer.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So I have a few questions, and then I think after this panel, we'll take a little bit of public testimony and then transition to the second. So I just want to start with sort of what's already been decided, and it is malleable, as Councillor Pressley has said, and you are creating lots of opportunities for public feedback, but it is set in stone, essentially, that this will be a cashless system on board, right?
Yes, there will not be cash on board.
And have you set the policies that will determine kind of what is the acceptable radius for any bus line, not just the ones where you would look now at current data and see people with a higher propensity of wanting to pay cash on board, but anywhere, because we want everyone in the city to be able to use the system in any part of the city and beyond. What is the acceptable radius that person would have to walk to reload once they realize, oh, I'm out, or I actually do want to ride the bus. I wasn't planning on it. Now I have to go fill my card. So
there are contract standards to that, which is that's what our private party needs to do. So those are set. As we mentioned, there are these additional ability to place so that we can go beyond those contract standards where needed.
What is the minimum right now? Or the maximum, I guess?
It's relatively complex, but the key pieces are that 95% on one end or the other need to be within, I believe, 1,000 feet, and 98% within 2,000 feet.
Okay. And so one of the things that's good about those types of standards is that they change based on the sort of changing of our ridership pattern. So it's not just going to be the data that we have. Correct me if I'm wrong,
Yep.
David. They're not going to just get set by like how people are riding today by our old data. But if the data changes, then those locations will also have to change to fit where our ridership is.
And the reason that I say it's complex is because there's a lot of other standards that go with that. So, for example, at intermodal transfer points, you need to have a fare vending machine regardless of what it would be, and it needs to be, if there's a level switch, you need to have a fare vending machine. So just because it's a transfer point, if you have to go up or down 3 levels, it's not okay for it to be 3 levels down. All Zone 1A stations, for example, on the commuter rail, need to have a fare vending machine. There's a whole set of other standards that go beyond it, but there's sort of a basic coverage principle. There's a second piece, which is also a queuing principle, which is it's not sufficient to just have the fare vending machines. You have to have the right number of fare vending machines so that people don't end up lining up on the first of the month if that's what they're doing. So there's a whole set of these principles that are out there. But as I said before, that's the math, and the math of what we see we think is very effective, but it isn't always reflective completely of lived experience. So we do have flexibility to add beyond that to make sure that it does reflect lived experience.
So in terms of transferring that to or applying this conversation to your iterative approach, your timeline says that fair sales locations will be identified in, it looks like, early 2019. When would the first draft of those be kind of publicly available for people to react to?
So I think that we're gonna do outreach, sort of asking people, where they think is important, so that we're not sort of where they think it is important to have their vending machines even before there's a map of sort of what our vendors put out, and then we'll sort of compare those two, and then we'll have a map. So I'm guessing that it's going to be towards the end of this year where we would say okay, here's sort of where we're thinking based on the public outreach and based on what our vendor came back with, and then we'll sort of do another round in the iterative process with here's the draft map. What do people think?
Okay. And in terms of the impact because of the retail network that you'll be recruiting, are there incentives for the business? I mean, do they get an annual maintenance
They get
boost,
paid.
or
I mean, they get part of the card.
how much? What is the incentive?
I don't remember what it is contractually, but obviously that doesn't get passed on to the customer. That's something that, that cost is something that's part of what we pay for those retail locations to be part of the network.
So every small business that is designated a retail location will receive some fraction of the cost of the card back to them?
Of they sell. So if they sell $10 on a card, they'll receive 20 cents or whatever the number is.
Okay. And then there will be a limit, though, on the number of stores that can participate based on just the actual, funding of infrastructure that you have, the actual number of.
So this is where it gets a little bit complex. There isn't a limit. The infrastructure that we're putting out there is not significant. That's not a cost driver. That's not a limit for us. That's not a limit for our vendor. Really, the limit is in terms of the stores themselves. That is, if you have a store in every corner, it's no longer much of an incentive for a retailer. If there's 12 Starbucks on a block, and it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. If there's 12 retailers all next to each other that all sell Charlie cards, you can imagine that they may not want to do that. That's really why we project that there won't be 15,000, why we project that there'll be about 600, because there's some sort of competitive piece there within the retailers.
But will it be sort of first come, first serve in terms, because I'm just imagining, thinking about there are certain business associations for convenience stores and smaller businesses. Who is going to choose who gets this potential benefit of getting a sort of piece of the sales?
So that's a conversation that we're having with our vendor at the moment. So there isn't really that much more of an answer to that than that. It's not a sort of a first come, first serve, or that it's making sure that there's appropriate geographic balance so that we don't end up with 12 locations on one block and no locations somewhere else. Obviously taking account of, where the retail deserts are and which retailers are interested in terms of that recruitment.
Okay, and I would just add, I can feel Councillor Pressley jumping in with this, because we have partnered on issues to make sure that the city's procurement processes, whenever we as a public entity are putting dollars out into the economy, that there's equity in who has access to those opportunities, and that there's accountability on the back end of understanding what the diversity is and what the representation is once you've chosen those businesses. So in addition to geographic balance, really making sure that you are using this opportunity to empower MWBE's locally owned businesses, and I'm sure the council and our colleagues and advocates would also be eager to help make sure that there is balance.
Absolutely, while ensuring that they meet their basic needs, which is to make sure that they're in the right locations for the people who need to buy them. Absolutely.
Okay, so that will be something we can follow up on. The vendor contract that you mentioned is now a public-private partnership. How long does that go until?
It's a 13-year contract.
And is your plan to evaluate at year 10 of extension, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of complexity in there, but it's a 13-year contract with an option for 2 5-year periods after that. There's a number of years into it, we evaluate it. A number of years before it ends, we evaluate it.
Okay. And each of these buckets of policies that you're developing now, who ultimately has the decision-making power? Is it just a vote of the FMCB?
It actually depends on which one. So the privacy policy will be something that will be adopted by the FMCB. The locations of the fare vending machines, I don't imagine there being like necessarily need to be a vote on that, but it's something that we will brief them on.
So that will be you deciding, or the secretary deciding, or?
I mean, I suspect that it will be, we have an executive steering committee for this project. It'll be, which includes the general manager, that it would be that body that would sort of sign off on the final plan for that. What I'm envisioning in terms of how the inspections work is that we will draft sort of a principle of principles for inspections that would be passed by the Fiscal Management and Control Board, sort of to allow that public process to happen. It's not something that they would like legislatively need to do, but to sort of make it be a very sort of public effort, and then that our sort of internal work would be finalized by the general manager to like sort of set up that team. And then the last one in terms of actual fares, those are done by, that's voted on by the Fiscal Management and Control Board. The other piece I would like to go back to is that there's a few things that are legislatively set, like the fines. And so there's a few things that the legislature has sort of power over, that if we need to change, we would need a legislative change.
Okay.
I'm sorry, what is that price point? What is that amount?
Yeah, so the first fine is 100 for the first offense, second offense maybe 200 or
Yeah, and then
300,
the
and then
third-
the third is 600. So they're quite high.
Yeah.
And so I think that we're interested in having a conversation with the legislature about that.
Just a couple questions on enforcement. I know everyone's being really patient who wants to testify. How many, when you look at other cities that have similar systems, how many employees doing the enforcement do you need per rider, or what are we talking about? That every bus will have someone, or is it?
Yeah, no. So yeah, we've started to do that best practice research of how other cities are doing it. I think it's going to be like a random check, so it's not going to be, you're going to be checked on every bus every time. And so we're still figuring out the math based basically on sort of how often we sort of expect people to be checked, then sort of how many, based on our ridership, how many sort of teams we would need to be able to perform those checks. So we haven't figured out a number for that yet.
And is it set, or are you fully committed to making sure that every single one of these employees has bias training, and I'm going to echo the push for civilian enforcement, given I think the magnitude of interactions and different experiences with different communities. But is that part of the principles that will be adopted?
So yeah, that's what would be in the principles. I can't commit to anything right now, but that is what would be in the principle. I'm envisioning would be in the principles, and we want to get input from, I think, folks like yourself as well as the general public on those types of things. But definitely, we are thinking through sort of what training the teams would need, what the standard operating procedures would need to be to ensure that there isn't, chances for discrimination. Like all of those things are sort of what we're thinking through in terms of how we actually set these inspection teams up.
Okay. Okay, great. So I know you've been surprised I haven't brought it up an hour in. I'm going to just put my plug in. You mentioned 1A, so you sort of brought it upon yourself, but we need to make sure that fare equity is incorporated prior to the launch of this. There's opportunities for pilots. I know we're pushing the legislature to have that study go through, but all the technology in the world is not going to improve the experience for people who still can't afford it at the right rate. So we know we have advocates here from the Fairmount line, and that has opened up doors a lot, but there needs to be increased frequency. There needs to be regional rail. There's a lot of things we're talking about, but today, or the next Monday that the Fiscal Management and Control Board meets, you have the authority to impose, create fare equity in Boston on the commuter rail pricing scheme. And so I'm going to keep pushing for it. Someone recently sent me a little newspaper clipping from, let me just pull it up, from 1918. The Boston Globe, Friday, December 27th, 1918. It says, "It is expected that the protest meeting against the poor transportation facilities in the Rosendale and West Roxbury districts to be held in the auditorium of the Rosendale Municipal Building tonight will be a very lively affair," et cetera, et cetera. We had a similar hearing very close to there 2 years ago about the same issue. So it's been a while. I know many of my colleagues have been right here and just using the platform to keep pushing on this. But I know you all know the issue very well from me as well, so thank you.
Yeah, I'll just note that I'm actually very excited to do the study that we talked to the legislators about, because I think there's some good ways that we can really dive into the data and see how the zones are impacting people's travel. And so I think that we're looking forward to doing that and to seeing how those results can sort of impact what decisions are made.
Great. Wonderful. Any other questions from my colleagues?
Just a couple of things.
Yes.
Obviously, I support that, and again, thank you for your leadership around 1A, Councillor Wu. And not only do I think we need to consider a new distance-based pricing, again, also just fare mitigation, because it is a burden that's disproportionately bore. But my question is just, I wanted to just dig into sort of revenue and data a little bit. So for the fare evasion policy right now, I just want to make sure I understand what that is and how that's being enforced and what kind of revenue is collected right now, and then where do those funds go?
So for our currently how it's done?
Yes.
I won't have the numbers in front of me, but currently we don't have a proof of payment system, which means that we don't ask people if they've paid if they're already on one of our vehicles, because you could have paid cash at the front of the door and you don't have any way to prove that. So the only ways that people are really cited for fare evasion is if they're seen jumping over a fare gate, or they are refuse to pay at the front of the bus, and so those are the only sort of ways that people are currently cited for fare evasion. I don't, off the top of my head, remember the exact numbers of how many citations are written a year. It's not particularly high, and then. So I don't think there's very much revenue collected from the citations. I'll have to go get the exact numbers for you, but currently it's not a very large source of revenue for us at all.
Okay. And then I just want to, again, for the public record, I just was curious, so is the only way that this system will be accessible is through a smartphone or an app? So how are we dealing with?
You'll be able to get a card.
Like a Charlie
Just
card.
the way you do
Right,
now.
at the retail locations that we've been talking about. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, what about tourists or people that might not immediately have access to this information?
Yep.
So they won't know about the retail outlets. So obviously I'm concerned
Well,
about
they'll be able to get cards at
the
the fare vending machines as well. And so there's sort of two pieces. So for tourists, and, obviously I think we're all more concerned about the people who live in the
Of
city
course.
than the tourists. But I guess they're useful as well. And so that's really a lot of the time where the contactless credit cards and the smartphones will come into play. That is that as a tourist, you won't actually, right now you have to go and you figure out, how do I do this? I have to get a card, how do I pay? What's that whole access system? Going forward, you'll still be able to get a card, but you'll also be able to use your credit card directly at a gate or getting onto a bus. So you'll just tap as you do right now without having to get a card. So we think that really for tourists, it's a big win.
Okay. All right, thank you.
I just got one question here.
Sure. Councillor Sabi George.
Pass the notes back here. There is a question, I don't even know who dropped it off, regarding snow removal, especially around not just stops, but the kiosks, so people can access them both with full mobility and any sort of impaired mobility. What's the plan around snow removal?
So I can say that there isn't a formal written plan yet, in the same way that we have at our bus stops, where there are a number of stops where we've assumed responsibility for snow removal as the MBTA, and we do. There are a number of other stops where the municipalities in which we work have the responsibility for the snow removal, and a significant number of stops in Boston. For any of our equipment, for any of the street furniture that's out there, I can't imagine that this would be significantly different from that, in the same way that the bus stop itself needs to be accessible for people to be able to get onto that vehicle.
Would there be any guidelines that you'd set up for an anticipated turnaround time? Because regardless of whose responsibility it is, it often takes much too long for that snow clearing to happen. at any of our stops.
Yeah. It's something that we'll take into account.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, whoever it was. The note spirits.
So I guess just last thing before we take some testimony. What are these are very detailed timelines. There's a lot that's going to go into it. And, we know from starting any public process that once you get into it, it just kind of grows and grows and grows in terms of the issues that you'll need to address and think through. What are the protections? How, if you had to bet or put a lot of money on the start date going according to what you've planned, are there protections in place that will make sure that it comes in on time, on budget, under budget even?
Yeah, so I feel very confident in the timeline because of the way that we procured this process, because the vendor itself as well as the MBTA have a financial interest in ensuring that it occurs on time. So it's not just us saying this needs to happen. The vendor has their own financial interest. So I feel very confident in these dates.
Okay, great. Anything else that either of you would want to add that we missed?
I mean, I think just that, we want to thank you again for allowing us to come talk about this, because it's something that we really need to get the word out, and we want to work with you on, reaching out to your constituents as we go forward on all of these, all of the sort of policy areas to make sure that we're partnering to make sure we hear everyone's voice on it.
Thank you. I hope you'll be able to stay for a little bit of the public
Absolutely.
testimony. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll transition to our second panel. So if Julia from ITDP, Stacy from Livable Streets Alliance, Alenza from the Fairmount Indigo Network, and Lee from ACE could come down and have a seat and on the floor. And in the meantime, I just want to get through a little bit of those who've been very patiently waiting. So as those folks are getting settled, if Leilani Roskowski from Green Roots and Ikra Asghar from the ACLU could make their ways to the public testimony podiums on either side. We'll hear your testimony before this panel starts. Okay, feel free. Go ahead. If you could just introduce yourself, your affiliation for the record, and keep it to 2 minutes for public testimony.
Great, yeah. My name is Leilani Mroskowski. I'm a Boston resident that is actually truly transit dependent, meaning for me, to get from point A to point B, I need the T. There's no other option, really. I'm also here representing Chelsea and East Boston residents as an organizer with Green Roots and a youth coordinator there. I'd actually like to thank Councillor Pressley for riding the 111 yesterday with some of my youth. And yeah, I'm here testifying on behalf of transit-dependent people and low-income communities regarding the AFC 2.0 system. I think that some serious considerations need to be made before rolling out the system. And again, I want to differentiate between people who choose to take public transit because it's more convenient than using their personal cars, and people who have no other option. The AFC 2.0 and other fare collection systems see customer service improvements and accessibility improvements as a matter of technological upgrades to advance time and physical on and offboarding. However, for vulnerable populations, we know that real improvements means equitable fares and a multitude of options for payment that considers all people that use public transit. Cashless systems exclude people who are not technologically connected to their finances and do not have bank accounts for various reasons. Some of these vulnerable populations include undocumented immigrants, homeless people, youth, and elderly. There are people that simply cannot afford to load money in advance onto their card, but rather find just enough cash in the moment to ride public transit when they need it. For those people, having the option to pay in cash at all stations, on all buses, at all bus stops is crucial to their livelihood. In Chelsea, for example, many residents commute to and from Boston for work. Chelsea is serviced only by buses and now the SL3. However, currently we do not have any fare vending machines in the city. I cannot stress how important it is for people using public transportation in Chelsea to have an option to use cash at all transit stops. With this development of a new Charlie card, we believe it is critical to develop a low-income pass. Green Roots has been instrumental in creating the Youth Pass, which allows for a 50% discount or $30 per month pass for low-income youth, mostly between the ages of 12 and 25. It is important to note that almost 120 Chelsea youth now have access to affordable transit because of this program, and also because of our proximity to East Boston, we have started accepting East Boston youth into our program in Chelsea. These are youth who are going to college, have jobs, and have many other responsibilities, but do not have the financial means to spend a lot of money on a necessity like transportation. And many of our participants in the Youth Pass program also inquire about fare reduction for their elders and their community members, who unfortunately are too old to qualify for the program. And yet, they still desperately need fare reduction. So when we think about improving accessibility and customer service, we really need to be thinking about these people, people who are truly transit dependent, who have no other option but to use the MBTA for survival, for their jobs, for their health obligations, and a low-income fare is an absolute necessity for those folks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ikra Esker from the ACLU of Massachusetts. On behalf of our over 10,000 members and activists in Boston, the ACLU of Massachusetts writes to inform the City Council about data privacy issues related to the MBTA's transition to a cashless fare system. Data is powerful and can be dangerous if left unregulated. Government agencies that collect, process, store, and share sensitive data about residents and visitors must do everything they can to limit the amount of information they collect and retain, and promptly delete or overwrite data when it is no longer needed. Government agencies in Massachusetts, including the MBTA, should implement fair information practices and standards to ensure they are doing all they can to protect the sensitive information residents and visitors entrust them to maintain. The MBTA collects, processes, stores, and shares extremely sensitive information about millions of T-riders, including seniors, students, people with disabilities, and people who pay for Charlie card services through their employer or with a credit card or bank card. The forthcoming cashless system is likely to collect even more detailed, granular information about T-riders' patterns of movement, including data revealing not only where people enter the system, but also where they exit. The ACLU has long been concerned about insufficient protections for sensitive T-rider data, and we see the MBTA's fare system overhaul as an excellent opportunity to make necessary enhancements to those protections. The MBTA's privacy policy governing rider data has not been updated since 2006. In the coming weeks, the ACLU will share extensive recommendations with the MBTA to shore up that policy to ensure it best protects riders. But one glaring problem with the existing policy rises to the top and should be on the Council's radar as you consider equity issues related to the transition to the new fare system: law enforcement access to rider data. The MBTA is not merely a transit agency. It also operates one of the most powerful and well-funded police departments in the Commonwealth. The MBTA's privacy policy does not clearly delineate how MBTA police officers or other law enforcement agencies are able to access sensitive rider information and provides no auditing or oversight mechanisms to ensure law enforcement access is not abused or misused. This has long been a problem, and it will become much worse when the MBTA transitions to a cashless system that tracks passengers at both the points of origin and destination. MBTA policy should clearly stipulate that no law enforcement agency, to include the MBTA police, shall have access to any rider information absent a probable cause warrant signed by a judge, except in limited emergencies. The MBTA must implement a firewall to ensure MBTA police do not have the ability to search the rider data and must instead go through the MBTA's general counsel to obtain such information, only after a showing of probable cause to a judge or in exigent circumstances when human life is at risk. Every such request should be documented, and the MBTA should report to the public on an annual basis, sharing information regarding the number of law enforcement requests for rider data and basic information about those requests. Ensuring strict controls over who can access rider data and under what circumstances is both a privacy and a racial justice issue. In Massachusetts, like other states nationwide, our criminal legal system is beset by racial disparities at every stage, from investigation to parole. A warrant requirement for police access to these sensitive records is an important mechanism for reducing harms on people and communities most frequently targeted by police surveillance and harassment. In recent years, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts has acknowledged the sensitivity of historical location information. In Commonwealth v. Augustine, the court ruled that law enforcement must obtain a warrant to demand historical cell site location information from a cell phone company. And just today, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled the same way in a similar case, Carpenter v. United States. These cell phone data, like the voluminous location records MBTA creates and stores about its millions of passengers, show where people traveled and when. The MBTA should apply the same principle to the enormous, sensitive troves of historical location data it maintains on T-riders and protect that data from law enforcement with the gold standard of American justice, the probable cause warrant. Thank you for the Council's interest in this important matter and for holding this hearing to inform Boston residents about the MBTA's new fare system.
Thank you very much. So I appreciate that. We'll finish the public testimony after this panel. So if panelists could, in whatever order you like, introduce yourselves, your affiliation, and feel free to give an opening statement.
All right, I think I'm the lucky starter here. Thanks for this opportunity. My name's Julia Wallers. I'm the Boston Program Manager for the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, that's ITDP. We are a global nonprofit based in New York that provides equitable and sustainable transportation, promotes equitable and sustainable transportation worldwide. First, I want to commend the MBTA for pursuing a cashless fare collection system, or AFC 2.0. Fare collection systems play a vital role in success or failure of any public transport system. Unaffordable fares and inappropriate collection methods can result in dissatisfaction and disappointment of passengers, while affordable fares, simplicity, and ease of use can attract more ridership and increase the equity of the region. With thorough research and public outreach and engagement now, we have an opportunity to ensure that the T's new fare collection system both satisfies existing riders and serves to attract new ones, especially those who need transit the most. We also have an opportunity to leverage this new fare collection method to significantly improve bus service in a number of ways, which can dramatically improve quality of life for the thousands of people who depend on it. Namely, by not involving onboard cash or tap card payments, we can first speed up and streamline the boarding process, because removing or reducing cash means less time dealing with transactions and more time driving. Reduce the amount of time a bus dwells at each stop waiting for people to board, thus speeding up the overall trip. We can remove what is often a top stress factor for drivers, which is dealing with people who don't have enough cash or stored value to pay their fare. And we can implement all-door boarding, which David mentioned in his presentation, for both the front and the back of the bus, which not only cuts down boarding time, but cuts down frustration of waiting in long lines to board. And finally, we can embrace off-board fare collection, which is a defining feature of bus rapid transit, a high-capacity, high-speed, customer-oriented mass transit system that is becoming increasingly popular in the U.S., including here in Boston. For the record, I would like to ask, I know David mentioned this, but a good question to ask would be if they have considered all-door boarding as part of the AFC 2.0 rollout, and if not, we would urge them to do so. So while I know I talked about bus service, while improving bus service is central to improving social equity, it is also so important to consider the structure of the fares, because the fare structure will, in a large manner, define the income and the equity of the system. In a city like Boston, where low-income groups take some of the longest trips on transit, flat fares can be most equitable. I don't know if the T is considering distance-based fares, but we know from cities around the country and the world who have implemented this type of fare structure, where you pay more the further you're going, that you end up having the poor at the fringes being the ones who end up paying the highest transportation costs. So in order to achieve greater social equity, a flat fare helps to give such low-income groups access to the services and opportunities in the city center and promotes a greater sense of social equity within the public transport system. On a related note, going through the process of adopting AFC 2.0 provides an opportunity to reassess fares at large. Providing fare discounts to special groups is a relatively common practice in public transport systems around the world, and I hope that the T will consider implementing income-based discounts. Other U.S. cities that face staggering income inequality, like in Boston, are turning to low-income fare subsidies as a way to maintain access to affordable transportation. As most of us know, this month, New York City committed to their Fair Fares, a low-income fare subsidy program for city residents, and Minneapolis and Seattle both offer income-based transit passes. However, it should be noted that none of these systems are also cashless. So Boston has an opportunity to really pave the way in this regard and set a new standard. Finally, it is critical that people understand how to access and use the new cashless fare collection system, and that the process of engaging them begins early, especially since cashless fare technology is new in general. I would ask if there's an outreach plan underway, and if there will be a formal steering committee for municipal officials, elected officials, community members, and advocates to oversee that process. Boston will very much be setting an example to other cities around the nation and the world. So it's so important to have the buy-in of the community before the rollout and to get this right. So I'd urge you to initiate an outreach process that involves MBTA officials going into communities and meeting people where they are rather than holding public meetings and seeing who's showing up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I didn't see a copy of your testimony on our desk, Julia. I don't know if you had provided, but if you didn't, if we could snag one after, because I'd love to make sure I have the copy of all the
Absolutely.
recommendations.
My apologies.
No, it's not your fault. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you. Melissa?
We're going to have
Oh,
Stacey go
Stacey,
next.
sorry.
I'm going to go next. Thanks. Thank you for holding this hearing, councilors. I'm Stacey Thompson, the Executive Director of Livable Streets Alliance. And I would say that my overarching message today is that we need policy before technology. I do applaud the MBTA for making a major investment in their system. However, the structure of that investment, the success of that investment will depend heavily on the policies and structures that we create to guide that implementation. And I think it's important for all of us to be thinking about the context within which we are trying to implement this system. Today, 23% of Bostonians, approximately 150,000 people, live below the federal poverty line. According to MAPC's State of Equity report, Black bus riders spend 64 more hours per year on buses relative to their white counterparts. We need to create policies that are explicitly designed to address these equity gaps, especially as the MBTA continues to increase fares. In 2019, the T will very likely vote to increase our fares, and that would be the second increase in 3 years. AFC 2.0 will not operate in isolation. It is coming at a time when our city and our region are grappling with inequity, and we have an obligation to ensure that the implementation does not compound those inequities. So what we would recommend is focusing on 3 key areas: fare policy, enforcement, and short-term mitigation efforts. When we look at fare policy, I would say blatantly that waiting until 2021 to figure this out is too long for the people that I mentioned earlier. The way we currently collect fares unfairly burdens those with the fewest resources, and I don't need to get into that, we've already covered much of it. Many low-income riders pay ride by ride, and they have no subsidy from their employers. I pay up front once a month, and my employer covers the cost of my pass. So what this means is that the folks who are paying ride by ride often pay in cash, and they come up short. They are penalized when they're, let's say, transferring from the Fairmount line to a bus. There is no cap on what they pay, so at the end of the month, I've paid a flat rate, and they may have paid more than me. These issues are largely not a matter of technology. They are a matter of policy. And we urge the T to address the issues of inequitable fare policy before rolling out AFC 2.0, because it will enhance the success of that great investment. We also need to know who currently is not able to pay full fares on the MBTA service, especially on our bus system, which services the largest portion of low-income riders. Here are a few solutions we'd recommend in this category: instituting a low-income fare policy, like our neighbors in New York. Just for context, they align that with SNAP benefits, and that again hits that $25,000 threshold. I would also just say that the folks in Seattle, which Julia mentioned, right now 25,000 residents are part of that income-based program. So we know that these programs are very popular and successful. I will say, however, that there are a couple of things that we would recommend that are based on the new technology. One is to create a fare capping policy, which we would be able to do with the new system, and allowing for free transfers between commuter rails, trains, bus lines, which I know is also on the docket and something that I think we should really focus on and make sure happens. In terms of enforcement, this has already come up, but I would just say we need to be clear about who is responsible for enforcing these new rules. Will it be T Police? What will the penalty be? If a child gets on the back of the bus and didn't pay, will that child be kicked off of the bus? Will they be asked to pay something? These are important questions we need to address today. Right now, we have a policy choice to make. We can choose to make the fare inspection teams an intimidating force that further police our most vulnerable communities, or we can develop equitable procedures and principles that lead to fairer, safer measures for enforcing these new policies. Today, if you park your car outside of City Hall, and you don't pay the meter, you're not going to be confronted by an armed police officer. You're going to get a ticket, and it's probably not going to be very scary. We want to make sure that you don't have something scarier happening to you on the T. We need to make sure that people have access to opportunity, not more opportunities to be criminalized. And in terms of mitigation efforts, I think you'll hear a lot from my colleagues specifically, but there are many, many things that we have been asking for in the short term already around making our system more accessible, including looking at Zone 1 fares. And we think that it would be a great idea for the T to look at both piloting some of the measures that, things that they want to do as a form of mitigation. So, for example, there's a lot of concern about where people will be able to purchase these fares. Can we look at communities that are already underserved and test out some of the strategies that we would recommend around making sure that specific types of businesses have access to that business first, or measures around wayfinding so that if you are new to this community or maybe this country and English isn't your first language and you show up at a bus stop that has no information, you know how to get somewhere to pay fare. We can test all of these things now that will both function as mitigation and as a way to test the new system. And last but not least, I want to be very clear about what the city and our leaders can do. David and Laurel, who testified earlier, as was made clear, are often not the decision makers. The decision makers will be General Manager Ramirez, Secretary Pollack, the governor, and the legislature largely. It is critical that the mayor and the city council show leadership and are clear about the needs and expectations we have as a city, and we look forward to working with you and the T to make sure that AFC 2.0 is successful and serves everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to express a lot of thanks for having this hearing. Councillor Pressley, Councillor Wu, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak on an issue that will dramatically change the bus rider experience. My name is Lee Matsueda. I'm offering testimony on behalf of the T-Riders Union, which is a program at Alternatives for Community Environment. We're based in Dudley Square, Roxbury, and as a multi-issue environmental justice organization, one of the key components of our work has been on public transportation, particularly with bus riders in Roxbury, Dorchester, people who are transit dependent. When we actually started our work on public transportation, it was really through the lens of public health. Asthma, air quality were the issues. But in doing that work, I think we really saw that the state and the MBTA had a lot of work to do to really address the needs of people from low-income communities and communities of color. And that is surfacing, again, when we're talking about this new fare collection system. I wish I could say that the T-Riders Union feels fully prepared to deal with this change in technology and the implications of that technology in our transportation system. And I would argue that none of us really are until we continue to have these type of hard conversations and particularly directly engage with some of the folks that are going to be most acutely affected by the changes in technology. And we talked about who those communities are. You know, few of these things are actually designed with these communities in mind. And in the context of, as we've heard from previous individuals, of growing and extreme income inequality in the region, we have to keep doing everything we can to make sure we get this right. There's hundreds of millions of dollars, public dollars, not just the private dollars, that are at stake here. So how do we do that? I think there are some three key things I want to focus on now. Much have been echoed already before, but I'll just say it again. I think I definitely agree, you know, more transparency. We're talking about continued and improved community and stakeholder engagement and regular reporting about the process around automated fare collection design and implementation. You know, the need is really great here to inform, educate, and engage the public and key stakeholders on this new technology. And we have to make sure that those who are going to get potentially shut out from the system are directly served. And so one key thing that I think I want to mention here is we have put in a very direct request with the MBTA to make sure that we're very clear about what the fare policy, or excuse me, the fare evasion policy is for the MBTA. And I think it's more on the front of, you know, how do they determine where they're placed, how often they're in a neighborhood, you know, the issue of profiling and so on and so forth, I think can only be expanded on and even worsened with this new fare collection system. And so as we've talked about, if the driver is not enforcing that payment with this tap in, tap out system, who is? And that is a key primary concern for our members and riders we've talked to. Just as an example, we did a sort of survey of riders, mostly in Roxbury, on buses at bus stations. 80% of them identified as transit dependent. That is a neighborhood where, as many of you know, it's, you know, family of four, median income is $35,000 roughly, as compared to, you know, about $100 for the city of Boston. And so what they were saying was 70% had no idea about the cashless system. 86% want MBTA workers, as we've heard, not T-police to check the fares, and over half believe that the MBTA police on buses will not actually increase safety. And so I enter into this with that in mind. There are people who are desperate to sort of know more about the system, but also have some very key perspectives on that. That kind of relates to the second piece, which is we believe the state and the MBTA has to commit to a fare collection program or fare evasion sort of program that increases access and supports a healthier relationship between the MBTA police and the riding public. This can't be another project that increases racial and economic disparity in our region. This new system has to work for people who operate primarily in cash, who are unbanked or underbanked. As we've also heard, it's really potentially a very dangerous opportunity to actually escalate existing tensions between MBTA police and the community. Young people are a huge part of that. We have a youth program. That is one of the key concerns they have. And as it said earlier, this is something that's kind of in state law right now. So we are talking to state legislators about the interests of how it's enforced and what the penalties are. Because right now it's sort of dictated by both drivers, operators, the T-police, and inspectors are the only ones by law that can actually ask for riders' information. But we do strongly recommend that the MBTA employees and not police are going to be enforcing these fares into the new system. The third thing I think we've already heard about is definitely addressing fare inequity now and looking at the key policy issues that I think Stacey was talking about before. Councillor Wu, I know you and many other advocates have talked about Zone 1A. One of the projects that we care about deeply, and I think was testified earlier by the young woman in Chelsea, the Youth Pass, we believe there needs to be new attention put towards that. I think roughly overall the 8 municipalities, there's only 2,000 people that are currently accessing that benefit, and there are thousands and thousands more that deserve it and should have access. But we're not doing a good job about telling people about it and want to work with the MBTA in the city to figure out how to expand that access. So we're actually working on a report over the summer to highlight some of these barriers and provide some direct recommendations, and want to follow up with you all about that. Speaking to the policy piece specifically, I think we definitely support the low-income fare, any future study and or pilot of that program, and of course the fare cap as well. So I think just the last thing I'll just say is, I really do appreciate this conversation. I think it needs to be ongoing. Going forward, we're willing to offer our perspective and specific ideas both to the council and the MBTA. And again, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
Good afternoon. My name is Ayanna Michelle, and I'm the coordinator of the Fairmont Indigo Network. It is a umbrella organization of 32 organizations and coalitions that serve the Fairmont Line neighborhoods. These are Mattapan, Hyde Park, Roxbury, and Dorchester. I was also heavily involved in the Youth Pass campaign years ago, and would like to echo a lot of the sentiments of my colleagues here, and would like to focus on 6 points in particular. I'm also joined here with Mela Miles, who is the chair of the Fairmont Indigo Transit Coalition, which specifically focuses on the Fairmont Transit line. AFC 2.0 absolutely requires to involve a robust and effective community engagement strategy if it's to be successful. We must deploy both quantitative and qualitative data measures to inform the process that reaches and targets the Boston area's most marginalized groups, which include youth, seniors, persons with disabilities, persons where English is not their first language, and those who are at or below the federal poverty line. We also encourage the addition of creative and equitable methods to be employed, and the appropriate amount of resources distributed to ensure that that process really targets and really engages the right audience that it needs. Secondly, while most of the data has been focused on major bus lines, which is driving a lot of the development of AFC 2.0, we also ask that there be some examination on the impact and the reduction of connecting bus services that have particularly impacted commuter times in the inner city. For example, we all know that there has been a major focus on the 39 bus route because ridership is down nearly 30% on that bus route. However, there's very little focus on the 14 bus, for example, which is a connecting bus route, and one of the only buses that serves the Heat Street projects in Jamaica Plain. This means that those riders who are heavily reliant on public transit are even more being at a disservice, and we'd like to make sure that as this new process rolls out, that issues such as connecting buses are also addressed. Thirdly, access to purchase Charlie card readers has been a chronic problem in particularly neighborhoods of color, and in particular the Fairmount neighborhoods, where the majority of places where one can purchase a Charlie card are check cashing centers, which have been proven to be detrimental to the overall economic development and wealth opportunities for low-income residents. Therefore, we're very interested in learning about what are the various sites in which the places of purchasing the new AFC 2.0 cards and or other alternative systems will be available. We also encourage the MBTA to think about partnerships with small business owners such as bodegas and other businesses that have access to internet and electronic transit dispensaries, because that could be an interesting option. Fourthly, while we know that the unbanked population here in the Boston area is relatively low, according to a Federal Reserve Bank study in 2013, only 4.9% of low-income and minority people of color were found to have no access to a bank account or a debit card. This also means that that population is heavily reliant on preloadable debit cards, which is a concern because those incur high costs, fees, and other transaction fees, just for activation, for example. So, if the Charlie card readers are going to be synchronized with debit cards, for example, and the unbanked have very little option and are forced to rely on preloadable debit cards, which have a high income, a high fee rate impact, then we're very concerned about the impact that that would have on that population in particular. Lastly, the integration of low-income fare systems like a low-income fare structure and youth passes remain a question. The Fairmount Indigo Network looks forward to working with the MBTA and the city partners to ensure that AFC 2.0 is also integrated with external lines, namely the Fairmount Indigo line, which we have long advocated for access to Charlie card readers. The line itself, which is currently the only commuter rail line that starts and ends within the city limits, and also the only commuter rail line that was born out of local activism, is a huge concern for our current residents because we're very concerned about the fact that this transit line is not only still in development, but how will it be well integrated with AFC 2.0 as needed. We still have an ongoing issue with the current bus routes that connect with the Fairmount line, having a lack of schedule synchronicity. Further, this system can be even greater impactful if it's synchronized with regional fare systems along the other regional transit authorities. For example, connecting with the BAT buses and with buses that extend to northern Massachusetts and western Massachusetts. That way, former Boston residents who have been displaced due to gentrification and other types of displacement will have an opportunity to have more feasible and affordable commuter transit into the city where they still work. It is imperative that we take into account all the structural pressures that impact quality of life and impact transit, such as housing, wealth inequality, environmental justice, and other lack of economic opportunity in neighborhoods that have historically been underserved and underinvested in. We recognize that these are complicated issues, but with equity and fairness, it's never said to be an easy task. So we thank you very much for your consideration and time, and I'll submit a copy of this testimony.
Thank you, everyone. Councillor Pressley.
Oh, well, first I just want to thank you for the work that you do in community every day, and thank you for your comprehensive testimonies, and also for being so solution-oriented and specific in your recommendations. And so you really took away a lot of my questions because you were so forward-thinking in your testimony, your presentations here today. So I'm losing my voice, so in this moment I'm okay. I know the chair had to step away for a moment. Councillor Sabi George.
I am in the same situation as you. I think that you've done an incredible amount of work. I think I would like to just thank you for continuing to push us in this work and support our efforts over here as we really are looking to support your efforts from the organizations and the work that you represent. And know that without your efforts, we certainly wouldn't be as motivated to do this work on this end. So I thank you all and look forward to, as this rollout happens over time, that we get it right, especially for those that will have the most difficulty accessing their opportunities to ride the T to get to where they need to be.
I have one question, and I just do want to shout out Livable Streets and Green Routes. Had a great time yesterday. It was very informative riding the 111. And I just wanted to make sure that I had my facts correct because I asked earlier what was the criteria in order to have more accessible machines. Was it based upon foot traffic, and how does one make those requests? And I just wanted to make sure I had my facts correct. Is there not one in Chelsea? Because so many of the youth that I spoke with yesterday spoke about a lack of access, and so changing their route and taking the Silver Line instead, which is actually more expensive because they couldn't reload, that there wasn't a machine accessible to them to reload onto a Charlie card. So is that a constant experience specific to Chelsea?
Well, so I'm going to ask folks, maybe from Chelsea, to answer this question more directly. But one thing that I can tell you from chatting with the folks specifically yesterday is that there were a couple of factors. One is that youth felt the experience of being intimidated and having difficulty on the bus to begin with. So they maybe were 10 cents short and they were trying to pay. So they can pay with cash on the buses, right? Like that's an option. And then they alternatively, if they were choosing to try to avoid being intimidated on the bus, had difficulty accessing a place to reload their card. My understanding is there are places, but it's difficult. And I would just say, I do want to follow up on your earlier questions around criteria, because there are two different buckets, and I think we have to be very clear about that. There's what's built into the contract with the company that will implement these services, which is around a number of feet you can be away from a space. That's different than sort of all of the soft measures that we discussed. What I don't understand and what I would love clarity on is how those soft measures are communicated to the contractor and what their obligation is to implement them. Like if we go through this process and decide we need 3 times the number of card readers available to people, how does that impact the contract that we've built in? So it seems like there are 2 different tracks and it's unclear how they speak to each other.
I appreciate that. So let's get the response from Green Routes, and then can someone from the T speak to that question? Okay.
Yeah, so in Chelsea, the only way that you can buy T fare right
Is her mic on? Is their mic on?
is to pay on the bus or on the SL3 vehicle. So the SL3 has been enrolled as of April, and at all of the stations on SL3, there are no actual vending machines, but you can buy on the bus. And similar to what you were saying, a lot of our youth experience hostility when they're loading up their coins into the machine. So it's a very just unpleasant experience.
Because it's a more delayed onboarding?
Yes, and in the
Right,
morning,
and
as
so
you're going to
people aren't
school, there's a
patient.
lot of people
Yeah.
out there.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's, yes. Yep.
Frustration.
It's not a particularly complex answer. It's, we get to decide it, and they have to do it. There's an obligation. If we want to add more fair vending machines, more fair vending machines will be added.
Is there a financial implication associated with that?
Of course.
Okay. All right. Thank you all very much. And if you haven't already, please do make sure that we have our own copies of your testimony.
Yeah.
Very helpful resource in our collective advocacy efforts here.
Thank you.
All right, and so now I think we're going to move to public testimony. And by my read here, We have Leilani. All right. I thought there might be another one. I meet so many Ayannas these days, so you just never know. Okay. And so is this Ira? All right, so who's left? Catherine, Mila, and I can't read the first name. Last name is Leslie. Okay, what's your first name? Anna. Anna. Okay, great. So we'll hear from Catherine, Mila, and Anna in that order, and you can just come right here. And Mila, thank you for your sojourn and everything that made the Fairmont line possible. So pleased to have you with us today. So you can begin, yes.
Okay.
Name and affiliation and your testimony.
My name is Nella Myers, or Mila, as I'm called by some, which is all acceptable. And I am the, it's working. Feedback stop. I am the chair of the Fairmount Indigo Transit Coalition. And I'm also the lead organizer for the Greater Four Corners Action Coalition for the past 12 years. And we've been working on getting the Fairmount line up and run and done equitably. I have a few recommendations. We got 4 new stations put on the line, the last of which is now currently under construction in Mattapan at the Blue Hill Cummings station. Some of the things that I would like to say are that AFC 1.0 was not done properly, and AFC 2.0 is based upon the issue of the inequities that are existent that many of us have spoken about today as it relates to not having sufficient fare vending equipment, not having access to Charlie cards in our communities, especially what I'm working on along the Fairmount line, which houses 25% of the Boston population and the majority of the low income and people of color who live in the city of Boston. One of the things that would like to recommend as a mitigation to address this is to eliminate the surcharge for paying cash on board immediately. When AFC 1.0 was implemented, they implemented a penalty for utilizing cash on board, and then, of course, our low-income and bus-dependent communities are the prime people who are paying cash on board. We asked the MBTA in a meeting with some of my colleagues here who spoke earlier, where is the key place where surcharges are being collected? The number 1 place was Lynn, and they didn't give us what number 2, 3, 4, 5 were. The reason why is because there's nowhere to fill your Charlie card or even to access a Charlie card. So people are paying, and this is a disparate impact of their surcharge policy of paying cash on board. So when you look on the display of the fare box, the display does not display the currently agreed upon fare as designated when the fare increases were taking place. So the fare is $1.70 and $2.25. If you get on a bus, the fare is displayed as $2, even though the fare is $1.70. So when someone gets on and they have cash, it says, please pay $2. That is not the agreed upon fare for riding a bus. That is the fare for people who are paying cash. So these low-income folks who are riding in these bus-dependent communities are paying higher fares than people who can well afford or who can have access to Charlie cards. So one of the mitigations that I would recommend is that that surcharge for paying cash be removed in the interim before this AFC 2.0 goes into effect, so that the impact that is, the impact is reduced and people will not have to pay that higher fare. Where those surcharges went, I don't know. Why would you charge people that much money? So the T has been over collecting and then saying that they have to keep raising fares, and we're already paying a higher fare. Implementing transfers from any Zone 1A connected station. So if you get off of the Fairmount line, you should be able to get a transfer to other parts of the system without having to pay your fare again. And also, one of my recommendations, so asking for this as a mitigation to implement transfers from any Zone 1A connected station. And also, to fix the issue right now would be to say, before AFC 2.0 goes into effect, those fare vending locations need to be installed now. Not 2 years from now, not 3 years from now, because the full implementation is 2021 completed, is the designation by the MBTA, but to start the implementation in 2020. So that would be another mitigation. Also, no student should be branded a fare evader or kicked off of any T vehicle, especially if they're traveling to school or any education-related events. Also, another recommendation would be that the fare vending equipment not be owned by private retailers, where they would have to pay for the repairs, because that reduces access to the riding public and access for those who are bus dependent and who need their fares to be able to be loaded properly, to be able to access those fares without having to wait because equipment is down. The MBTA should own that equipment. If they want to lease it out or whatever they want to do, they need to own it, because right now, in Four Corners where I work, there's no fare vending anything anywhere. And I also would like to know, why is it that, how did they come up with the 1,000 and 2,000 foot designation as to, if there's, that you put it within that of the most highly traveled bus stop? 1,000 feet is approximately a quarter of a mile, and we have seniors who have to travel really far, and that 1,000 feet is really far, and 2,000 feet is almost a half a mile. So I just want to know what the criteria is and why the T selected that large distance away from the most highly traveled stop. Because quite frankly, all of the stops on the 28 bus and the 23 bus are the most highly traveled stops, because the bus is never empty, and there's always people getting on those buses, and we shouldn't have to walk a quarter of a mile or more to try and find somewhere to reload a Charlie card. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, I didn't realize I had taken out of order according to how I said it. I know, that's why I asked you. Yes.
I looked at her, and then she said, go.
Okay. All
Sorry
right.
about that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your testimony,
Yes.
for your work every day. And maybe at the end, we'll follow up if the MBTA wants to respond to any of that, okay? But I'll defer now to our chair.
Thank you for
who's
subbing
back.
in. Catherine,
Yes.
please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Catherine Carlson. I'm the Director of Transportation at A Better City. We are a business association, which I think many of you know. We represent 130 businesses and institutions in the greater Boston area. And on behalf of all of them, thank you so much for holding this hearing and for asking these important questions and for bringing all of these groups here to speak on this. We have a long history with AFC. In 2014, A Better City initiated a conversation with the Department of Transportation and with support from the Bar Foundation to look at how we get to a unified payment system. That work resulted in a report entitled The Unified Transportation Payment Media, Options for Massachusetts, that was released in April of 2015. So we have a long history and a vested interest in this process and this rollout, and we are encouraged by the work and the conversations that are happening. I also say that we have a vested interest because we know as an organization and our members understand that the strength of the economy, the strength of their business opportunities relies on providing opportunity and mobility across all neighborhoods, to all residents, to all employees, and across all income levels. Our members employ executives, and they also employ janitors. Our members employ doctors. They also employ kitchen workers. And so it is important to all of us that this rollout and this process is a success and is equitable. What I'm here mainly to say because of that is that please consider us a partner, and the feedback, in these conversations. I am proud to be able to work with a lot of the stakeholders who spoke and have these conversations, and with the T, and we're encouraged at the efforts that they are making, and we encourage you as the city, and we encourage everyone to consider the business community as a partner in this endeavor. A Better City also manages 2 transportation management associations where we work very closely with employers to provide options and incentive programs to their employees. And through that system, we have a great system of outreach that we do, which we are also happy to provide any help in this endeavor. We are currently working with the MBTA and their Corporate Pass program and how to encourage employers to provide more opportunities to their employees. I know Stacy had mentioned that even her small organization provides funding for T-passes, and we are actively working with all of our members to ensure that that's more widespread, and we will continue to do so. And so thank you for all the work, and we look forward to continuing to work with all of you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Anna Leslie.
My name is Anna Leslie. I am the coordinator of the Alston Brighton Health Collaborative. I also work for Union Capital Boston, UCB, which I know some of you know well, and I thank you for that. I have just a few points, some concerns, and then some suggestions. I would love to see members of MassDOT and MBTA come to the Alston Brighton Health Collaborative Transportation Committee meetings. We had the Better Bus Project join us last night at our meeting in partnership with Livable Streets Alliance. So we invite you to come into these spaces, and to that point around public engagement, I recommend don't reinvent spaces, use existing spaces. There are so many spaces in communities where people do gather, and I invite you to join those spaces and not recreate focus groups. Along those lines, these might be things that you already know, but I'm going to say them anyway. Please always provide food and childcare and interpretation services at your meetings. I have been to MassDOT meetings where there are 3 people, and there are 3 reasons why there are only 3 people there. There's no food, there's no childcare, and there's no interpretation. So please take that and go with it. I do have concerns around convenience for people who are fully reliant on public transit. I am voluntarily reliant on public transit. I can afford to own a car, and I choose not to, but I can afford to use alternative methods if I need to, and I know that people cannot make that choice, and so I am particularly concerned for older adults, for people with strollers and children, for people with groceries, for people traveling in the snow. How are they moving from station to station to reload their cards? I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for the people that are verifying the payment system on the bus. Is there an opportunity for them to carry Charlie cards and have a small reloading system so that you can just get on the bus, and if your card is out, that person can just help you reload it right on the bus. So can we think a bit more creatively so that we are not requiring people to move large distances for a small amount of money? I do have concerns around profiling, which I will just kind of echo what everybody has already said. I know because of interpersonal and institutionalized and systemic racism, I won't be profiled, but my friends and neighbors and people important to me will be, and I'm concerned about that. I think that's all I will say. One other thing is both of my organizations welcome you to the table, welcome you to partner with us in our networks. Union Capital Boston has a network of over 1,200 people around the city who are earning rewards for their civic engagement. We would love to see those rewards turned into Charlie cards. Currently, they are turned into Visa gift cards up to $600 a year that people are earning for their civic engagement. We would love to partner with the MBTA to see that turned into Charlie cards and make this system a little bit more compatible with the things that people are already doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to testify? Feel free to come down to the microphones at this point if you would. I'm not seeing any takers. And did Laurel and David want to add anything now that you've heard feedback, or? No pressure though.
Thanks to everyone who commented, and we took some notes, and we're hoping to reach out, especially the invitation to join your meetings is appreciated. I did want to address one of the things that Mela had raised around I believe you were talking about the difference between the bus price paid in cash and the Charlie ticket and the Charlie card. And I'm happy to get that data for you of where that is, where we see the most boardings, people paying in cash and using the Charlie tickets. And that surcharge will not exist in the new system. There won't be a different price based on what media. It'll be one price no matter if you're paying with your credit card or a smartphone or the new Charlie card.
Great. Thank you very much, Laurel. So would either of my colleagues like to make any final statements?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for your partnership on this, and thank all the writers and the advocates here today, and the MBTA. I think it was a robust conversation. Appreciate folks again being so prescriptive in their recommendations, and look forward to working with the chair and the MBTA in follow-up, and certainly will be using our platforms to make sure folks are aware of and connected to any ongoing community meetings and discussions. Again, the process is a malleable one, and we want you all to continue to inform it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pressley. I do want to, I'll confer with the lead sponsor and colleagues after this, but because there have been so many consistent themes and I think big picture principles that seem to be coalescing, it could make sense for the council to seek to consolidate that into a letter that we can give to the T as part of this kickoff to public feedback, and at least kind of stake some of our positions out so that you have that for clarity. But we'll follow up on that front. I also do want to let everyone know, since you're interested in transit and transportation and access, the council next Thursday will be having a hearing on parking management and our resident parking system. So we'd love to see you here again. We also have something in the docket that I know Councillor Sabi George has been really eager to work with me on getting out there, which is our docket calling for a hearing order on the MBTA's local assessment, the $80-some million that the City of Boston pays to the T every single year, and what that means in terms of decision-making and the services that our Boston residents are provided. So stay tuned for that. This then will conclude the hearing on docket number 0175, order for a hearing regarding equitable access to public transportation with a cashless fare collection system. This hearing is adjourned.